This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Christmas is coming, and for a lot of people, old and young, video games are going to be on their wish lists. But if you're buying for a younger person or want to be careful about the content you're buying, where do you turn? Adam Ross has been speaking to Andy Robertson, the founder of the Family Gaming Database.
It was about 5 years ago. I wrote the book Taming Gaming just before the pandemic hit, and that was delayed. And so we created this site that was going to promote the book, which was for families, just to find games. And then it kind of took off and became bigger than the book, really. And so we've been doing that ever since, and have built a small team, and have just been adding a couple of games a day, helping families understand games that they're already playing, and also kind of vary their diet and what else they might play.
Because children age. So we know that the game they were playing 18 months, 2 years ago is just not going to be appealing for somebody who was 4 and is now 6, or was 7 and is now 9.
It can feel kind of hard to stay ahead of it. And kind of the thinking is, with the right information and without all the jargon, parents can actually kind of play a bigger role in discovering games, rather than kind of saying no, and then finally saying yes to whatever the latest thing is. Have a different sort of conversation where they're like, well, maybe not this yet, but there's this other game that we found on this site, and why don't we play this? And because the games we add are games that we think are really good, and we sort of say what age group they're really good for, that parent has a really good chance of putting into the hands of their children a game they then fall in love with, which completely transforms the conversation in the home and makes gaming something that they talk about together, and does a lot of the heavy lifting to make them safe and healthy, and parents and kids can enjoy them together.
Yeah, so we're not on the cliche view of playing a video game in their room away from everyone else. That's not what we're looking at here, is it? Yeah,
so that happens eventually after most families. But the idea is that before they're kind of a late teenager, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you don't want them to just be doing that and just be seeing games as something that they understand and you don't as a parent. Because then if you are sort of saying, perhaps you need to change your habits, they can quite rightly say, oh, you don't understand, like you haven't done it and you don't know about it. Whereas if you've built up this thing as a sort of a family activity, they're much more likely to actually just want to tell you about it and tell you about the fun they're having and how they're progressing. And you have sort of different questions. And that moment where if something unexpected or unpleasant does happen in a game, if they're playing online, you're going to have that relationship. So they will think, oh, I will tell mum or dad, rather than, oh, I better not tell mum because she'll take my game away. So you sort of got that kind of framework and scaffolding, so that at those crucial moments, they're going to come to you and say, this doesn't feel right. Well, let's talk about it. Like, is this okay or not? And, at that stage, you're, really happy that you've spent the time and effort to make it a family thing.
Mm. Funnily enough, something similar happened to me with 2000 AD back in 1980, I think it was. My mother became convinced it was a negative influence, and arguably it probably was, and forbade me from buying it at the local newsagents. I just went to a newsagent further afield and still bought 2000 AD. This kind of conversation happens in different medias at different stages of their life cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think, as a parent, you want to know what your kids are doing, not just to keep them safe, but to kind of enjoy that. And often a child can introduce something into a family that then they all enjoy. Games that my kids have really loved, we've ended up playing together, and they're still our favourites that we'll get out at Christmas or whenever. And whatever it is, comics or films or series, I think it's a nice thing to set a family up so that you can enjoy it together.
You gather around the Rocket League come Christmas kind of thing, is it?
yeah, Rocket League. Like, it depends what you want, really. And obviously, there's new games every year. But the classics are still good. Mario Kart, Rocket League. The sort of the platforming games. But again, the idea of the site and the book is that to kind of get out beyond those kind of big hitter blockbusters to kind of a more varied diet, and finding games that are really good fit for your family specifically because of the ages you've got and also maybe the interests you've got. And so the database lets you search in a more detailed way. And often those games are a lot cheaper as well. So you can kind of avoid spending £50-60 every few months.
Well, of course, which is the headline number for a lot of the big AAA and sort of AA releases these days, isn't it? I mean, it's not cheap if you're going in at the top of the market, is it?
Yeah, and that's another part of the conversation,
Mm,
understanding where the spend comes from, because the games that are free, well, they're free to start, we probably say these days. Then they come with kind of, you don't necessarily have to buy in-game purchases to get sort of items and outfits and skins, as they call them. But that's the direction of travel, and that's what other kids in the playground at school, will be doing. And so, sort of coming in knowing that, well, one thing is I don't necessarily want to have a big price ticket, but also, the cheap or the free games can come with other prices associated as well. And on the database, we have a breakdown for every game that says, is there an upfront cost? Is there
mm,
further spend you can make in the game? Does it have things like loot boxes where you don't necessarily know what you're getting before you start spending? And also, is there a subscription to play the game, particularly playing online? The game can be cheap or free, but you're going to need to spend, a sort of a more than a Netflix subscription to get online and play with your friends.
mm, mm. A few years ago, of course, the whole Toys to Life market was there. Lego was in there, Skylanders. Trying to think of who else was there. Some Nintendo stuff as well. That market's sort of gone away now, though, hasn't it? That's been replaced by microtransactions and in more in-game sort of light. I'm going to say lighter. I mean, less physical kinds of spends.
Yeah, I think it was an interesting time because that physicality of the game, I think, is something that families quite liked and parents quite like too. So it's this interesting crossover that we kind of feel more comfortable and you understand what you're spending when you're spending on a toy. Even if the toy is expensive, you're getting a physical object. Whereas if you're spending, say, in Fortnite or World of Tanks or whatever it is to get a particular vehicle or a particular thing, and it's £20, it's a bit like, oh, that's a bit odd. So I think that those kind of, as we called them, toys to life games, where you've got a little figure and that kind of unlocked stuff in the game and did stuff, was actually a toy as well. Yeah, so it was quite good. But I think it kind of got saturated and saw its day. And the kind of that move to more playing with a large number of people online is what's become popular, and that has been, I think, what has sort of picked up and just become this huge thing that kids are clearly wanting connection and all sorts of other things they get from those games. So there's kind of a shift in the generations, and makes some of us who've been playing for longer feel a bit older.
Well, the other thing, of course, we're talking about playing online and playing with randoms or however you want to characterize it. That has a kind of a risk associated with it, which is kind of what you were talking about earlier on about good habits, wasn't it? About the good habits of being an online player. Do you think there's a generational shift, or are we still seeing a lot of people sort of trash talking and all those other rather negative things you get in some forums and some games?
Yeah, I think it just depends who you're playing with, and how you're playing. And sometimes you can just have bad luck and you just come across a bunch of people, or an individual who's just out to cause trouble, like a sort of bully in the playground type of thing. I think the challenge is that often those are the things that get reported on, and we can feel, as kind of people who don't play in those spaces, that that's all it is, that these are toxic spaces and we need to close them down and make them safe. And again, all we do is create distance from ourselves and our kids so that when something very serious does happen, they're less likely to come to us. So I think you can have, really good experiences online, and in all modern consoles, you have the ability to say who my child can play with.
Mm.
Do they have to put a code in so they can only play with people they know in the real world? Are they able to use the microphone? Are they able to use chat? And all the big games have moderation and are pretty good at picking up on that. But of course, it's like the playground. You're going to have some bad experiences with the good. But what I see in my kids is that what they get out of that is much more than just playing. There's lots of identity work and kind of socializing and trying out different sort of types of personality and like learning to work as a team and communication. So the list goes on. So I think it's easy to underestimate these spaces, and to close them down too quickly, I think actually is detrimental to kind of well-being of kids, particularly when they don't have other spaces like this in the real world. Often because we design cities around motor cars, and so those kind of outside spaces aren't safe. And so they've come here. So I'm reluctant to close these down too quickly as well.
Mm-hmm. So it plays into a lot of different conversations. I mean, we could talk about the reason that PricewaterhouseCooper, I think it's them, sort of actively recruit people who play certain kinds of games online because they see a benefit to their recruitment strategy from going after those kinds of people who work collaboratively in an online space. But that's not quite what we're talking about today. So the family gaming database, you're up to 3,055 video games and 197 board games. I mean, that sounds like an amazingly large number of family appropriate games to me, Andy.
Yep, it keeps going, and I'm often thinking, the team together, we research and we add a couple of games a day, and we've done it every day for about 5 years on and off. Obviously, there's some breaks, uh, and it feels like, well, surely we've found them all now. But every day we'll come across, we've got a long list of games we'd like to add, and it's not just games that are super perfect for families. It's also the games that are kind of on the edge of that. So if there's a game that maybe is more questionable and a parent needs to look it up, often Roblox games are hard to decipher, like what's actually going on here, how much is it going to cost? And so we'll spend a day, one of our experts, playing the game, researching it, and writing up our page, so that within probably 2 or 3 minutes of reading our page, you'll have a really good idea of that. So it's this kind of this mix. But all of these games are, if a child comes to you asking about a game, whatever it is, if it's older rated or younger rated, or something that's just kind of the talk of the playground, our work is that we've already got there first. And so as a parent, in a couple of minutes, you can read up on it and kind of be ahead of the curve. Not to sort of say no, but to understand the experience and to make an informed choice. And if there isn't an appropriate game for whatever reason, we then offer loads of alternatives that are similar to the game you're looking at, but maybe more age appropriate, maybe a bit easier, or maybe a bit harder. So you can kind of find your way. So yeah, it's actually a really enjoyable process, because we get to kind of write these little love letters to each of these games to kind of the developers often kind of like what we write, in terms of kind of bottling the kind of the lightning in a bottle that they've got, and getting that in front of parents.
Mm-hmm. You get a lot of war stories from people on various different online channels talking about, oh, the day that somebody came in trying to buy Grand Theft Auto for their 12-year-old, and then came in the day after saying, how could you sell me this appalling game? It's completely inappropriate. Do you think we're seeing less of that, or is there still is there a rump out there of people who think, oh, video game equals kids, video game equals, oh, the 18 rating doesn't really mean an 18 rating?
Yeah, I mean, you don't see it so much because obviously the purchases are largely made online.
Mm.
And so it's kind of out of sight. I think there still is the sense that if a parent has a child and all their peers are playing a particular game, they're unlikely to say no to that game. And so really what we're into is to sort of say, rather than you should say no and kind of wagging their finger, to say, well, okay, that's fine to say yes, but say yes in an informed way. And I think when parents read up on these older rated games, if they are saying yes, they will usually do something like, oh, well, let's play it a bit first, or you can play it, but play it downstairs and on the screen I can see, so that then the child has a chance to process it. And that's what I think that's a much more positive way to move forward. But there will be, parents, and I've probably done it as well. You're busy and a child asks you something and you're just like, oh, well, get you out of my hair for a bit. So yes. And then later on, you can look back and think, maybe that wasn't the right choice. But I think as you realize that, it's not a one hit, win or fail, but to continue that conversation. And I think by providing parents with information, they can keep taking small steps into understanding this. And it is, parents are busy. It's a complicated, often a new and quite scary thing. So supporting them to do that and take positive moves is something that we really value.
Mm. We're seeing a lot of smaller games. You talked about that. A lot of what I think of as faster games, the games that have come to market that bit quicker, from indies and from other places coming in. Which sort of spaces are they going for? Are they addressing the sort of family-friendly, child-friendly, young person-friendly market a bit more, or are they looking to create some more sort of socially engaging games? What was your feeling about what's happening in the market?
Yeah, you do see there's this rise of indie games made by small teams, independent teams. Although that kind of title seems to cover a lot of games that often have, teams of 40, 50 people. But you see those kind of niches hitting really strong, and game makers know if they get it right, they can sell 1 million games without having a big publisher behind them. So the talk of this year is a game called Balatro, which is a poker themed game. So it ends up with an 18 rating, although it's not actually poker; it's just themed around that. But it's basically a game of trying to stack the poker deck of cards in your favor by changing it and applying different multipliers so that you can score points. It's a very mathematical game. So that's a niche game that's been made essentially by one person that is selling in its millions. So you sort of see that, but you also see games that are very much aimed at families. There's a game called All You Need Is Help, where you have these kind of fluffy Tetris pieces that you have to try and move around. It's 4 players. And the thing is, you can't rotate on your own. So you have to press up against another player in the game to be able to rotate and get yourself into that right position. So in that game, the kind of the fun is in the room as you're trying to, you're shouting and calling to each other, we need to go this way, or like, who's the yellow one? We need to move around green. And so again, that's a very niche experience, but it's finding a really big audience. So I think that's what I'm seeing as one of these things, is that developers know that. The challenge is that everybody knows that. And so there's thousands of games being released every month. And so sometimes you come across a game that's absolutely amazing. We add it to the database, get it in front of families, but you see it probably has sold in its thousands. And just because the noise of so many games being released at one time, it's impossible for them all to get that kind of airtime. So it's a kind of a contested market, but the rewards are there. If you get it right, you can win very big, and big as an independent publisher.
The other thing that's come up, I kind of think, is the sort of dragged up games that look like they're young person friendly and possibly accessible and those kinds of things, but actually might not be, because they are, despite the fact the lead character is a sort of a super deformed kind of, that's a very old fashioned phrase about from anime, like a cutesy little character, but they're not really doing a cutesy little thing. Do you see that? I mean, I'm thinking about things like Lego Horizon Adventures, which is sort of taken from the Horizon Zero Dawn sort of universe, which is a game which deals with a lot of very adult themes. But it's been Legoized, which is kind of cute, because Aloy looks quite nice as a Lego figure. And there's been a Lego tall neck, which is a model that I've actually got in the cupboard there, they're not built. So I can see why they do it, but I'm just find myself thinking, is that the right universe for Lego to be in? I mean, have you played that game?
Yeah, I've played Lego Horizon, whatever it is, Zero Dawn. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's just Lego Horizon. And it's a very nice kind of Lego, more family friendly version of a game, which I think was Peggy 16, the main game, because it's quite violent, because it's got a very full on story. And so they're taking that and they're kind of remolding it to a younger player. And I think part of that is probably it's a popular franchise and it makes a lot of sense financially. But it could be a nice on ramp for players into that universe, so you can kind of see it a little bit cynically while they're doing that. But for kids, don't really care. It's a nice two-player game. The controls are very simple. You only need to use one stick and a few buttons. You don't have to control the camera with the other stick. So that's really nice. And I guess, it's something that Lego has always done in these games, the sort of Lego Indiana Jones. Is Indiana Jones a kid's movie? It kind of is, but I think if I showed it to my kids when they were like 10 or younger, it goes to some sort of, it has horror elements in it, and other franchises like Batman and stuff. So I don't think it's a new direction. I think quite interesting is a game called Funko Fusion, which is from the team behind some of the people who used to make Lego games, set up their own studio to create this game around the Funko collectible toys, which are obviously not just for kids, because they're just the statues that sit on the shelf. You kind of collect them, and that's kind of meant that they can go doing the Lego thing, but in a more grown-up direction. It's a Peggy 16 rated game, so it's designed for an older audience. But that's kind of opened the door to actually embracing, this is for people who just love this film, whatever it was, Back to the Future or like Hot Fuzz or The Thing. So really some really quite grown-up franchises, but do them still in a fun way. But be clear, that this is a 16 plus, so it's older. So there's these interesting moves in this space, I think, as the market is trying to work out how to land and how to deal with this audience that has grown up with Lego games and are now probably in their 20s, mid-20s, if they started playing those when they first came out, and trying to attract that audience, but in a way that's age appropriate in terms of the content's actually a bit more mature.
The Thing, but for kids, that sort of Hudsucker Proxy moment, I can't see that working at all. Thank heavens they didn't even try, because there's some bits that happen in The Thing that still scare the hell out of me.
Yes,
frankly, I'm thinking of the head that grows legs. Anyway, let's not dwell, because it's not appropriate. When it comes to the sort of the wider conversation about games and about screen time in particular, Professor Pete Etchells has had a book out called Unlocked, where he's talking about the approaches to screen time, and he's trying to sort of demystify and take the heat out of that conversation a bit. Do you feel like you're part of that process of demystifying, taking the heat out, that we are moving to a more mature place when it comes to young people, screens, games, all of that kind of experience?
Yeah, certainly that does feel like territory that if you're in this space, you have to talk about it. Um, and it feels like there's important work to do here. And Pete's and I've read his book and I've talked to him. He's a great voice in this space. And I think that's mainly because he's not aiming to polarize the debate like I think other voices are, or other reporting, or other books are, that would kind of misunderstand some of the benefits and kind of say it's something new, we don't know what it is, so we need to lock it down, rather than having a sort of a more middle ground of saying, we need to empower and bring literacy to parents so that they can understand and guide children's behavior. Of course, we don't want kids to be on screens all the time, and every parent, wants kids outside and getting muddy in trees and all those kind of sentimental things that we want them to do as well, and that's really important. But I think we also want to have kind of nuanced ways of talking about, well, what does healthy screen time, to use that phrase, look like? Because screen time is such a catch-all thing. They might be doing a lesson on Zoom, they might be talking to a grandparent, they might be playing a game, they might be doing their homework or watching a TV show. And so thinking more about, well, what's on the screen, and also the context of where they're playing. Where is the screen? Are they playing on their own, or is this time like after school? They're just kind of having some zone out time because they've had a really busy, hectic day with everything that goes on in the school while they're there. And so I think moving towards the sort of stuff that Pete talks about, and getting away from these kind of catch-all phrases like screen time or like dopamine hits and stuff, which actually, when he goes back to the science really helpfully, you realize don't stand up in the way that other people are saying they stand up. They kind of talk about them as if they're the home run. And like this proves it. And it feels like common sense, but actually it's misunderstanding the science. It's misrepresenting both kids and games. And it is kind of muddying this conversation that we need to be so careful about, to really actually support parents and kids to talk better about this stuff. And so if we're not careful, this screen time phrase can actually make the whole debate a much more polarized and a much less helpful. So there's work to be done, but I think people like Pete are doing some great writing, and his book's well worth following up on.
Especially if you've got a young person who's going to be dealing with screen time for themselves, or you're helping them to deal with it, I suppose.
Yeah. And just the starting point of knowing that the tools are there. If it gets out of hand, the tools to kind of limit what they do when where are completely there, and they have a pin on them, so it's not like kids can get around it. Often I say parents who will say, "Oh, I don't set up any settings because my kids will just get around it." And of course, if we took that approach to our bank cards, I just give them the bank card because they'll figure out the pin, which it is secure. So that's a really good way to get breathing space if it's got out of hand and you're just like, just stop. Would you playing the whole time? I don't understand it. Let's just limit it to an hour a day. But the important thing then is to think, well, that's breathing time to have a better conversation and to get to a place where the child can self-regulate, and together as a family you're enjoying this hobby, rather than, okay, limit the games, job done, we'll move on. So I think that's a much better approach.
We're into the Advent season almost, Andy. So where are you sending people? What are the games that are your picks for this Christmas?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot to choose from. There's the kind of the big budget, more well-known games. There's a new Princess Peach game on Switch. There's a Zelda game called The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom, where Zelda's the actual hero of the game. And this is interesting because it's a departure from previous games, because rather than fighting enemies and kind of directly with a sword and a shield, you can conjure objects into the world. So anything you found. So if you find a bed, you can suddenly conjure these different beds. And so it's a much more creative way of solving problems. And also, you don't fight enemies directly. Once you defeat one, you can then conjure that enemy. So you're kind of bringing them in to fight on your behalf. So it's interesting, and it's also really good for younger kids, because if they haven't got the dexterity, reaction times to do that kind of stuff themselves, this is a Zelda game that works well for them, and I've been enjoying that. It reminds me of Scribblenauts in that you kind of just almost bring anything in and being creative.
That was the name that I was sitting here racking my brains. I'm thinking it sounds like something I've played. It sounds like something I've played. Scribblenauts. Thank you so much. Because that was always getting Cthulhu into those ones was always quite good fun. It's like that's actually in the database for that. But that was on the DS, and I suppose, which is a legacy device of a legacy device now, isn't it?
Yeah, but so if you remember that game, this is quite similar in that you can use all these objects in very creative ways. And so any parent or family playing this together with their child, there's just loads of really sort of big wins. Another game that I really like is Snufkin Melody of Moomin Valley. It's a Moomin game, and often these kind of tie-ins are a bit kind of underfunded or underdeveloped, but this is a really lovely kind of whimsical journey into the Moomin world. And you have these kind of sneaking around gardens and kind of it's interesting, you're trying to kind of mess up the gardens because the humans have come along and made them too tidy. So it's kind of this flipped, weird environmental story that I quite like. And it's got a great soundtrack by Sigur Rós, which again, that is a nice kind of signpost that this game is doing something out of the ordinary, that it's got some properly good music in it. So that's another recommendation. Another interesting game is a game called Paper Trail. You're sort of going on this quest journey, but what's interesting is that the whole world is made out of paper. But then you can fold the world on itself, and by doing that, you combine the back and the front of the world in different ways to solve puzzles and to find a way forward. With that simple kind of premise, it takes that and sort of develops it in ways which are really like inventive. I've been enjoying that as well.
Simple premise. That sounds like a sort of hellish amount of computer sort of work being done in there. Like, we'll probably put Monument Valley to shame, which played with that whole Escher thing, didn't it? You know.
Yeah, it has that kind of feel that it's reality bending.
That was Andy Robertson of the Family Gaming Database talking to my colleague Adam Rosser. More to come on 5 Live this morning after the news.